I've come to some of the final battlefields on the Western Fronts, the landscape of the Western Front today, where in those final weeks of the First World War, the British and Commonwealth forces were pushing the German army back. Trench warfare was over, and on this vast open landscape around me, the Germans were using the terrain to defend this ground. There were no trenches, no barbed wire, and no man's land. It was a big open battlefield, and the men of the 1st, 4th and the 1st, 5th York and Lancs, fighting their final big attack of the Great War, advanced over this towards the village of Haspres behind me and the Selle River valley. And on that landscape of that final battle of the Great War for them is a small battlefield cemetery that bears their name, and that's where I'm walking to next. And this journey brings me to York Cemetery at Haspres, a battlefield cemetery made in October 1918. And as I walk in, I can see the small number of burials here are dominated by one cap badge, the York and Lancaster Regiment, the tiger of the regiment's symbol, and the Yorkshire rose, symbolising the birthplace of many of these men from Barnsley and Rotherham and from Sheffield, who were killed in their last major battle of the war on the 13th of October 1918 and buried here after the attack across this open ground by the divisional burial officer. Very much a comrade cemetery of the First World War, where the men of specific units, in this case the Hallamshires and the 1st, 5th York and Lancs, who made this attack together, are buried side by side. And I'm going to visit one grave in particular here, just at the end of this row. Among the dead from South Yorkshire buried here in the aptly named York Cemetery is Lieutenant Arnold Ibbotson. He was a young lad from Sheffield who joined the Royal Engineers at the beginning of the First World War. He'd run a draper's shop in Sheffield, and he was commissioned into his local battalion, the Hallamshire Battalion of the York and Lancs, in 1917, and he served with them at the Third Battle of Ypres and in the German offensive of the spring of 1918. And then he was killed attached to the trench mortars that were part of his infantry brigade. So he was out there with Stokes mortars laying down mortar fire to protect these infantry soldiers moving forward in that final great battle of the Hallamshires on the 13th of October 1918, only a few weeks before the end of the war. And my interest in him comes from his memorial plaque, which I rescued from a junk shop many years ago. More than 1 million of these were given to the next of kin of the soldiers who died in the Great War. They're incredibly personal, each one to a soldier who fell, and incredibly beautiful, tangible objects that connect us with not just a history of the Great War, but the men and the women who were part of that Great War. I like to think that this was once on his mother's shelf in her front room, and she took this down at night and held it in her hand and thought of her lad. The family nickname for him was Toddy, and he has Toddy on his grave, and Toddy lies buried here now, and this plaque has commemorated him for more than a century. And this is what we find when we explore and we walk and we travel the pathways of the Great War in places like this, York Cemetery at Haspres, here on the old front line.